Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Robert Weisberg, and although, of course, the Constitution is meant to be enduring, I myself am speaking to you under my rather more ephemeral title of Interim Dean Designate of the Law School. Anyway, I'm delighted that you've all come. I welcome you to one of the first major academic events of the year. Constitution Day, of course, commemorates the signing of the Constitution on September 17th, 1787. Federal law designates a Constitution and Citizenship Day and requires educational institutions receiving federal funding, we have to take that quite seriously, to hold an educational program on the U.S. Constitution on that day or a nearby weekday like today. And by the way, since we lawyers require citations for absolutely anything we say, see 36 U.S. Code 106, okay? It's especially gratifying to welcome Rabbi Meir Soloveichik to deliver this year's Constitution Day lecture, which, as you know, is entitled George Washington's Jewish Letters and the Creation of a Constitutional Republic. This wonderful event is organized by our own Stanford Constitutional Law Center at the law school on behalf of the whole university. The Constitutional Law Center was founded in 2006. It focuses its work on such fundamental matters as the separation and scope of legislative, executive, and judicial powers, the structure of constitutional democracy, elections and voting, and the freedoms of speech, press, and religion, and the role of history in constitutional interpretation. The center grows out of the long and distinguished tradition of constitutional law scholarship at Stanford Law School. It seeks to carry on this tradition through programs of conferences, lectures, informal constitutional conversations, and fellowships. Tonight's event is part of this tradition. I'll add that we also have a tradition of young scholars serving as staff and research fellows at the Constitutional Law Center and then going on to great academic careers. And indeed, I'll take special pride in noting that one of our own, one of the Constitutional Law Fellows from some years back, Judd Campbell, has just joined the Stanford faculty as Professor of Law. So I want to thank him. Now, my main task is to introduce my good friend and colleague, Professor Michael McConnell, who is, of course, the center's faculty director. Professor McConnell is the Richard and Frances Mallory Professor of Law at Stanford and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. For decades, he has been acclaimed as one of the nation's leading constitutional scholars and truly the singular leader in the field of religion and the Constitution. In 2002, after serving on the faculties of the University of Chicago and the University of Utah, Professor McConnell became circuit judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. Upon stepping down from the bench in 2009, he joined the faculty of the law school and took on the directorship of the center. Let me add a personal note that Professor McConnell and I go back pretty far. There's a picture in my office of the two of us with two or three other people 40 years ago when we were co-clerks together. So I knew him when he was a very young lawyer, and I was not quite as young, but younger than I am now lawyer. I like to point out that one could tell immediately in those early days that Professor McConnell was one of the deepest, wisest thinkers of constitutional law and jurisprudence one could hope to meet. He had learned his law in the most rigorous of training grounds, the University of Chicago Law School. Let me just say, I still had an advantage over him. I had my education right here at Stanford. Anyway, so I'm now going to turn things over to Michael, who will in turn introduce our distinguished speaker. Michael?
Thank you, Mr. Acting Dean or prospective Acting Dean. I assure everyone here that I did not ask him to give such a lengthy introduction of me because I'm going to get down in just a second and introduce the speaker. But I did want to welcome everyone to this Constitution Day lecture. This is has really become one of the singular scholarly events at the law school, and it's especially enjoyable because it's a time to welcome the first-year students, most of whom have just arrived, and a number of whom are in the room. And I don't even know, or maybe a few of them, but I don't even know them yet. But that doesn't keep me from giving them an extremely warm welcome. So good to meet you all. But my job here is to introduce our speaker for this evening, who is the Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. He's known to his friends as Solly, probably because in order to keep people like me with bad, awkward tongues from stumbling over the name. Rabbi Soloveichik is the rabbi of Shearith, Israel, which is the oldest Jewish congregation in the United States, I understand. And he and I bonded, 10, 15 years ago when we discovered we have such a strong mutual interest in some of the leading Jewish figures at the time of the founding who were important not just for religion in the Constitution, which is my particular interest, but other aspects of constitutionalism as well. And I think it's fair to say that our speaker tonight is one of the foremost authorities on the Hebraic contribution to American constitutionalism. Maybe a little bit about his background. So he has his undergraduate degree, summa cum laude, from Yeshiva. He has his MDiv from Yale's Divinity School and a PhD in religion from Harvard. He has written, I don't know how many articles and a recent book. But I think what I'm most familiar with, and maybe some of you in the audience as well, is that he has done a series of podcasts called Bible 365, which is an absolutely marvelous introduction to the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, and a number of members of my family have been listening to it. So, in any event, he is a Bible scholar. He's a scholar of American constitutionalism, and because I've heard him preach at his synagogue in New York, I can testify that he's one of the great preachers that I have ever heard. If we can say preacher, I don't know if that's a proper word in the Jewish lingo. So in any event, please join me in welcoming Solly, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik.
I want to thank the Dean for his very warm welcome, and I want to thank Professor McConnell, Judge McConnell, my dear friend Michael, for the honor of this invitation. And it's so wonderful to see both you and Mary. I first met Judge McConnell, as he mentioned, around 15 years ago. I was so excited to learn that he was in New York, I insisted on taking him to a kosher deli. I think it was Mendy's. And then prevailed upon him, seeing as how this was his first time really experiencing New York Jewish cuisine, that he really had to have one of the original articles, and I think I made him order a massive pastrami sandwich. And then the waiter turned to me and said, "And for you, sir?" I said, "I'll have the salad, thanks." So he survived that, and now we are here together, and with both with you and with Mary, and it's so wonderful to be here with you. In her biography of the great pitcher Sandy Koufax, Jane Levy describes a watershed moment in the cultural memory of American Jewry, which is, of course, Koufax's famous refusal to pitch for the Dodgers in the first game of the World Series because it fell out on the holiest day of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur. Coach Walter Alston chose instead Don Drysdale, known as Big D, to pitch in Koufax's stead. And as Levy tells us, the Dodgers got destroyed. They got absolutely hammered. And so, as she tells us, the score was 7-1 when Alston came up to the mound to relieve Drysdale. And Drysdale looks at him and says, "Hey, Skip, bet you wish I was Jewish today, too." Levy writes, "For Jews, the loss was a win. If Big D could joke about being one of the chosen people, that was already something, a tacit acknowledgement of their acceptance into the mainstream. Shtetl, farewell." So she writes. Now, Don Drysdale might have been joking, but the truth is that one of the most fascinating aspects of the American story is that some of its founders and greatest figures identify deeply with the story of the Jewish people and saw the biblical story of ancient Israel as parallel to that of America. And unlike Don Drysdale, they meant it, I think, in all seriousness. And it's only with this in mind that we can truly appreciate what it means to mark Constitution Day, to study and celebrate a document, a text. The late Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, my very much missed friend, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, described the first time that he visited Washington, D.C. He went, he said, to the presidential memorials, Lincoln, Jefferson, etc. And he said that what fascinated me was that each came with its own texts. In other words, there weren't just statues, but the words of these figures were actually etched into the walls. He said, the Lincoln Memorial had the Gettysburg Address on one side and on the other the second inaugural, and so would the others. I suddenly realized, Rabbi Sachs said, that American memorials are not just to be seen, but also to be read. It's the exact opposite, he reflected, in London. Go to Parliament Square, and you will see that the memorial to David Lloyd George has just 3 words. David Lloyd George. Benjamin Disraeli gets 2. Benjamin and Disraeli. As for Churchill, who of course, for whom rhetoric was kind of important, Churchill gets just 1. Churchill. So what's it, Rabbi Sachs? What are we to make of this? The difference, he reflected, between the American and British monuments is unmistakable. And the reason is that Britain and the United States have a quite different political and moral culture. England is, or was until recently, a tradition-based society. In such societies, it is unnecessary to ask why. Those who belong know. Those who need to ask show thereby that they don't belong. American society, he reflected, is different because from the Pilgrim Fathers onward, it was based on the concept of covenant, as set out in Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, especially in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And Rabbi Sachs further writes, England is a traditional society where things are there because they're there. The United States is that rare phenomenon, a covenant society. Covenant societies represent conscious new beginnings. They are founded on an idea dedicated to a proposition. Rabbi Sachs was right. At the heart of the Hebrew Bible, the story of biblical Israel is the concept of covenant, in Hebrew brit. The story of a people liberated from Egypt for the purpose of covenanting at Sinai, uniting around a text, what Jews call the Torah, a series of laws, doctrines, ideas. To mark a Constitution Day is to reflect how America is a country, a nation defined by its dedication to ideas, to words, to a text. And when I first heard this from Rabbi Sachs, I began seeing everywhere this contrast between America and other countries, especially because I travel a lot. In gift shops, so in Heathrow, no one is selling replicas of the Magna Carta. What's for sale is not text, but images. There's pictures of the Queen, now of course of the King, and of palaces, and I myself own a mug which is, I think, from the Kensington Palace gift shop, which has on the mug pictures of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. And when you pour hot water into the mug, the 6 wives disappear. But only in America would one find a souvenir like this, a Constitution tie. with we the people. Article 1, Article 2. Dean, I would recommend this should be sold in the Stanford gift shop. I think that would be a great idea. I would like 10% for all the profits for this idea. Only in America would we have something like this in a tie. Only a society once impacted by the Hebrew Bible, only a country that at least once thought of itself as having a biblically inspired covenantal culture would define itself by ideas and could have something like this. And so I think that it is, in marking Constitution Day, I think it's appropriate that I intend to study with you today the Constitution itself through the eyes of the Jews that lived in America at the moment of the Constitution's ratification. For me, this is personal. As Professor McConnell mentioned, I serve as the rabbi of Congregation Shearith Israel in New York, the oldest Jewish congregation in America. We don't like to talk about that except pretty much every day. Our history began with the arrival of 23 Jews fleeing the Inquisition, arriving at what was then New Amsterdam in 1654, not that long after the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony. And these Jews, the Jews of this community, participated in the Revolution and in the birth of the American Republic. I will attempt to argue today that seeing the Constitution through the eyes of the Jews of this era allows us insight into the uniqueness of the ideas that the Constitution presents to us, especially as exemplified by the interaction of those early American Jews with the man who served as president of the Constitutional Convention and thereafter as the first president of the United States. And so our story begins with an amazing man, a German Jew by the name of Jonas Phillips, who arrived in America, in Charleston, in 1756. He made his way to New York. He became a member of my congregation, and he married a woman that he met there from one of the elite Jewish families. Jonas Phillips and his wife had, and I am not making this up, 21 children together. Jonas Phillips was literally one of American Jewry's founding fathers. In 1776, with the British converging on Manhattan, Phillips and his congregation, who were very, very largely patriot, not Tory, chose to flee, to leave New York. Or as one history of the congregation, they fled, as one history of the congregation puts it, they fled across the plains of Harlem and Washington Heights. They decamped to Philadelphia, where Phillips served in the Revolution, and ultimately decided to remain in this new city where he became enormously successful and good friends with many prominent Americans, including, or perhaps especially, with Benjamin Rush, the confidant of Adams and Jefferson, signer of the Declaration, and the most famous physician in America. When the Constitutional Convention met in 1787 in Philadelphia, Jonas Phillips wrote a letter to the convention and its president, George Washington. It is this extraordinary bit of correspondence that we will now see. The purpose of Jonas Phillips's letter was to complain. And this was the first time in Jewish history that a Jew complained. The reason for his complaint was that, according to Pennsylvania law, all public office holders were required to affirm by oath that both the Old and New Testament were given by divine inspiration. Let's read a little bit of the letter. This is the one on the top here, to George Washington from Jonas Phillips. He writes, "Sirs, with leave and submission I address myself." By the way, side note, one of the great things about reading Revolution-era documents is that they didn't have in those days the tyrannical spelling rules that we have to follow today. This was when America was truly a free country. You could spell any way you want, and you can make up words too. "Sirs, with leave and submission I address myself to those in whom there is wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. They are the honorable personages appointed and made overseers of a part of the terrestrial globe of the earth, namely the 13 United States of America in convention assembled. The Lord preserve them, amen." Not bad for somebody who got off the boat from Germany 20 years before. Phillips then goes on to describe this law, and he adds that in describing this oath, he adds that it is, quote, absolutely against the religious principle of a Jew, and it is against his conscience to take any such oath. And in this letter, he asked the convention to create a country in which, in his words, all religious societies are on an equal footing, meaning where all faiths were able to serve in the legislature while remaining true to their beliefs. Phillips then adds the following, and this is the fourth paragraph, and let's look at this very carefully. It's the smallest paragraph. This is truly amazing. He writes, "It is well known among all the citizens of the 13 United States that the Jews have been true and faithful Whigs," that means patriots, "and during the late contest with England, they have been foremost in aiding and assisting the states with their lives and fortunes. They have supported the cause, have bravely fought and bled for liberty, which they cannot enjoy." For liberty, which they cannot enjoy. So he writes, 1787, to George Washington and the Constitutional Convention. So let us pause here, ladies and gentlemen, to ponder the audacity, the chutzpah that Phillips is exhibiting here. Here you have somebody who's a friend of American founding fathers. He's wealthy, he's accepted, he's embraced. My ancestors, living at the time in Poland and Lithuania, would have given a lot to experience the life that he had. He just couldn't serve in the legislature if he wished to retain his fealty to Judaism. But Phillips is audaciously arguing to the most famous man in America, Washington, that if the Jews were not equally able to serve society without violating their faith and conscience, then they were not truly free, and America was not living up to the promise for which he had fought. Because at the essence of the Jewish notion of freedom, or at least what the Jews were seeking in America, was the ability to be part of general society fully, while remaining dedicated to what makes us different. It was my great uncle, the renowned Talmudist and Jewish philosopher, Rabbi Jonas Phillips, who argued that to be a Jew in the world is to seek to embody Abraham's introduction of himself to the individuals in Canaan amongst whom he lived. In Hebrew, Abraham said, "Ger v'toshav anochi imachem," which is translated as, "I am a stranger and a neighbor among you." And there's a dialectic here, a stranger and a neighbor. How can one be both stranger and neighbor? Rabbi Soloveichik interprets this as precisely embodying that dialectic. I am set apart by my faith, but dedicated to working with you. We seek, Rabbi Soloveichik said, to be loyal to what makes us different while working with every other member of society in order to build a better world. In Rabbi Soloveitchik's words, we believe we are bearers of a double charismatic load, that of the dignity of man and that of the sanctity of the covenantal community. And in truth, for Rabbi Soloveichik, a member of any faith community in a diverse society ought to see oneself as both neighbor and stranger. Because one is always going to be set apart by one's faith, but one should seek to be part of the larger society to contribute to it. And a just society, Rabbi Soloveichik argued, ought to allow members of every faith to engage society as an equal without sacrificing one's most sacred beliefs and observances, which sets one apart. It is just such a society for which Jonas Phillips fight here. And this, ladies and gentlemen, can be seen in the most striking but least noticed aspect of the Phillips letter, which is the date that he puts on top. Look on the top right. Jonas Phillips writes, Philadelphia, 24th Elul, 5547. That's the Hebrew date. Or, he writes, he wrote this, or September 7th, 1787. Why is he writing the Jewish date? There is not a single Jew in the Constitutional Convention. He's writing to Washington, who has probably never heard of the month of Elul in his life. He's writing to him, 24th Elul, or if you want the Goyish date, that's September 7th. But that's precisely the point. Phillips intends to emphasize that genuine equality means entering society, entering the legislature, entering the public square, as neighbor and stranger, as an American, without in any way being forced to amputate one's faith, one's religious identity from oneself. We have no response from Washington to Jonas Phillips, but we do know that around this time, I believe maybe 2 weeks before, the convention had already enshrined in its draft a bit of text that guaranteed, at the federal level, the equality that Phillips sought. And this is Article 6, Clause 3. I hope to find it in the tie, but I couldn't. I apologize. Which is, of course, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Now, this ban on religious tests applied only at the federal level, but the Jews rightly anticipated that equality of this kind in the Constitution would lead to a disappearance of state laws such as those in Pennsylvania, and so it was within a matter of decades. Phillips' story allows us to understand the uniqueness of the Jewish experience in America. It's often assumed that only in America did Jews find opportunity and prosperity like nowhere else. But the truth is that in 18th and 19th century England and in post-revolutionary France, Jews such as Moses Montefiore and the Rothschilds achieved wealth, prosperity unknown to the Jews of early America. But what Jews did find in America was genuine equality, not only as Americans but as Jews. In England, Jews were not welcomed in Parliament until the 1860s, late 1850s, early 1860s, and then only under great controversy, with the entire Tory party, except for Disraeli and one other person, opposing it. Even then, in post-revolutionary France, Jews were welcomed as neighbors, members of society, as long as there ceased to be anything strange about them. The most liberal member of the French Assembly after the Revolution was the Count of Clermont-Tonnerre, who famously said, some version of, "We will welcome you as Frenchmen, but that means you have to essentially cease to be separate as Jews." This conception of religion in society is reflected to this day in, for example, the 2004 French law banning the wearing of any religious garb in public schools, including Jewish kippot, Catholic crucifixes, Muslim headscarves, and Sikh turbans. Recently, I believe the French Senate voted to extend that ban to public sporting events as well. In America, in contrast, sometime before there was a First Amendment, Jews saw in the Constitution a promise of what America could be, why it offered them the opportunity to be neighbor and stranger, fully American and uniquely reflecting their faith, why their experience within this constitutional republic could be akin to nowhere else in diaspora history, nowhere else on earth. This is why, even as for the next many months a debate raged regarding the ratification of the new system of government, with many prominent heroes of the Revolution, such as Patrick Henry, ardently opposing it, poor James Madison, who was not known for his oratorical skills, had to debate Patrick Henry in the Virginia Assembly about the Constitution. I read somewhere that Jefferson, who was in France, advised Madison that the only way to defeat Patrick Henry in debate is to ardently pray for his imminent death. But, to my knowledge, there was not a single Jew in America that was an anti-federalist, that was against ratification of the Constitution. And the civic celebration of the Constitution's ratification vindicated the faith that Jews put in it. Thus, in the summer of 1788, a parade was held in Philadelphia celebrating Pennsylvania's vote to ratify the Constitution. And the event highlighted the Jewish ability to be wholeheartedly engaged in civic affairs without in any way sacrificing their open Jewishness to do so. We have two eyewitness accounts of that event, one non-Jewish, the other Jewish. The first is Benjamin Rush, Jonas Phillips' friend, who recorded a scene at the parade that struck him. He wrote, he saw the clergy of the different Christian denominations with the rabbi of the Jews walking arm in arm. Rush reflected that this was a most delightful sight. There could not have been a more happy emblem contrived of that section of the new Constitution, which opens its powers and offices alike, not only to every sect of Christians, but worthy men of every religion. Meanwhile, a Jew who was there, who had an eyewitness account, was Naphtali Phillips, Jonas Phillips' son, who was 15 years old at the time, and who wrote a recollection of the event on October 24th, 1868, 80 years later, after the Civil War, when he was 96 years old. You have a 96-year-old man after the Civil War describing the eyewitness account of the ratification of the Constitution. And Naphtali Phillips describes the parade, and then he adds the following. The procession then proceeded from about 3rd Street near Spruce, then wheeled towards Bush Hill, where there was a number of long tables loaded with all kinds of provisions, meaning food. And then he adds, with a separate table for the Jews who could not partake of the meals from the other tables. So this is a special kosher table. And he tells us that one of the items on this kosher table was soused salmon, which is lox, because obviously, you can't have a Jewish event without lox. This is quite possibly the first time that a separate kosher table was provided at a civic celebration anywhere on earth. And it is impossible to imagine such a phenomenon occurring in France or England in the 19th century, let alone in 1788. But in Philadelphia, celebrating the Constitution, Jews were welcomed as part of the civic and social fabric, as simultaneously stranger and neighbor. And when in the end the Anti-Federalists were defeated, the Constitution was ratified by the requisite 9 states, and then Washington was elected in 1789, the man to whom Jonas Phillips once wrote sought to emphasize the religious diversity of the nation that he led. It's very interesting. If you read the second of the Federalist Papers, I think Justice Scalia used to say that when he visits law schools, he asks law students if they've read the entire Federalist Papers. I'm not going to do that here today. But I'm not even going to ask if you've read the second of the Federalist Papers. But if you read it, you will find, it's one of the few composed by John Jay, that Jay argues that the constitutional system would succeed because, he writes, Americans were all the same. That's what he writes. He writes, quote, with equal pleasure I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. So John Jay writes. Now, by the same religion, Jay means, of course, Protestantism. But of course, Protestants were not the only individuals in America at the time. And the Protestants themselves were profoundly divided in doctrine. And at that time, these divisions mattered. I remember actually when I was studying religion at Yale, never finished at Yale, I went on to do my doctorate at Princeton, but at the student orientation at Yale Divinity School, we sat in this, circle on the lawn, and one of the students says something like, he says, I really feel like I'm sticking out here being a Presbyterian among so many Episcopalians. And I'm sitting there like the guy with the yarmulke is thinking, yeah, I hate when that happens. When you're Presbyterian, everyone's Episcopal, that is the worst, okay? But these differences mattered. And if John Jay did not understand this, George Washington certainly did. And he clearly thought a great deal about how faith can serve to strengthen the social fabric of this nation, of this nascent nation, even as America was marked by religious diversity. This point was made by the historian Michael Meyerson, who writes that, quote, the fundamental paradox of America's history of religion is that while the individual states began as narrowly focused, religiously homogeneous communities, the United States was born a pluralistic nation made up of multiple religious groups. The religious diversity of the country, combined with the powerful direction of the early national leaders, permitted the creation of a distinctly American concept of religious freedom. Washington, as Meyerson argues, was truly one of the fathers of religious liberty in America because he thought so deeply about this. And Washington, as he further notes, used language in public addresses which was very religious. Thus, for example, his farewell address, where he argued that of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. But Washington, in these major addresses, always avoided anything denominationally divisive. And when Washington wrote to particular religious communities, he would adapt his letters to the audience, highlighting how much he appreciated each one of their uniqueness, reflecting how the equality of each in America was not contingent on their stripping from their identity aspects of their faith which made them different and made them stand out. To paraphrase the scholar Paul Bowler, Washington deserves major credit along with Jefferson and Madison for establishing the ideals of religious liberty and freedom of conscience. He was able to speak in devout religious language without destroying the unity he was committed to creating. Washington sought a religious society in which difference was not denied. Thus, when Washington arrived in New York, America's first capital, to take the presidential oath at Federal Hall, his inaugural procession featured 14 clergymen from New York, 13 Christians, and my predecessor at Shearith, Israel, which, FYI, is the oldest congregation in America. The Reverend Gershom Mendes Satius participated in the inaugural parade with his fellow clergymen, and this was, I think, the first time a Jewish religious figure had played a ceremonial role in the installation of a head of state since the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Then, in that same year, 1789, Washington himself suggested, and then it was recommended by Congress, that a day of national thanksgiving be observed. And Washington's Declaration of Thanksgiving emphasized that what was being celebrated was both the importance of religious duty, but also the diversity of religion in America. He began, and this is here on your handout toward the bottom, he began by noting, whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. And then after this religious pronouncement, Washington added that for what Thanksgiving for America was all about was the ratification of the Constitution, or as he put it, gratitude was being expressed. And this is all the way at the bottom of the page. For the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been able to establish constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one now lately instituted, for the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed. Observing this national Thanksgiving in 1789 with Hebrew Psalms was my community, and my predecessor gave a Thanksgiving sermon expressing his profound gratitude for a government that, in his words, was founded upon the strictest principles of equal liberty and justice. And every year on Thanksgiving, in my synagogue on Thanksgiving, on Central Park West and West 70th Street in Manhattan, we say those same psalms that they said in 1789. And then we go outside to Central Park West to watch the Macy's Day Parade, just as they did in 1789. Thus did America's Jews, sometime before the ratification of the Bill of Rights, thank God for the gift of the Constitution and the equality of its promise. And yet, gratitude to God was given to the Jews. Well, gratitude to God was given by the Jews for the American Republic. But what about gratitude to George Washington? Here we come to an embarrassing, though amusing aspect of early American Jewish history. When Washington was elected, the various minority religious communities in America each sent Washington a letter of congratulations. All the Catholics in America got together and sent Washington a letter. All the Quakers united and sent Washington a letter. The Baptists got together and sent Washington a letter. The Jews in America could not agree who would send the letter, so they sent him 3 letters. There's maybe 1,000 Jews in the United States. 3 letters. American Jewry was spread across New York, Philadelphia, Newport, Richmond, Charleston, Savannah. No chief rabbi, then as now, to represent them all. Thus, in June of 1790, over a year after Washington's inauguration, my congregation, Shearith Israel, sent out a letter to the other Jewish communities asking them to team up to allow my community to send the oldest community in America to send out a letter to Washington on their behalf. To this invitation, Moses Satius, lay leader of the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, wrote regretfully that his community could not participate for a very basic reason. Rhode Island itself had not congratulated Washington on his election because, until very, very recently, Rhode Island was not really part of the United States. It had refused to ratify the Constitution, earning itself the nickname Rogue Island. And in early 1790, Congress was actually preparing a draft of a ban on trade with Rhode Island to cut it off from the United States. We might have seen, had history gone slightly differently, the great America-Rhode Island War of 1790, though I think we could have taken Rhode Island. But on May 29, 1790, Rhode Island ratified the Constitution just several days before a New York jury wrote to the Jews of Newport. So Moses Seixas writes from Rhode Island in June to the Jews of New York. He writes, "We only just now became a state. My own legislature has yet to reach out to the president, so we can't do it." But he adds in classic Jewish fashion, "But you guys should have done this sooner." From the Jews of Savannah, New York jury received what must have been an even more distressing reply. The Georgian Jews said essentially, "Oh, we sent our own letter on our own a month ago." Thus did Washington receive his first piece of correspondence from two Jewish Georgians, brothers, Mordechai and Levi Sheftal. I'm going to quote a bit of their letter, and then we'll see on the page Washington's response. The Sheftals wrote, "Our eccentric situation, added to a diffidence founded on the most profound respect, has thus long prevented our address." In other words, they're saying, you might be wondering why you haven't heard from American Jewry for a year since becoming president. It's because, they say, we're in such awe of you, we were a little afraid to write to you. This is what we would, I guess, technically call a lie. They continue, "Your unexampled liberality and extensive philanthropy have dispelled that cloud of bigotry and superstition, which as long as a veil shaded religion, enfranchised us with all the privileges and immunities of free citizens, and initiated us into the grand mass of legislative mechanism." Here again, in other words, we find reference to the ban on tests for religious office, the first source of the Jewish love for the Constitution. Now, in responding to this letter from the Jews of Savannah, all Washington needed to do was to thank them politely. Or he could have done further and said, yes, I agree, everyone is equal in America. But Washington does much more than that. He gives us one of the most incredible letters of his career, but also one of the least well-known. Let's see it. He writes, and this is on the second side of the page, George Washington to Savannah, Georgia. "Gentlemen, I thank you with great sincerity for your congratulations on my appointment to the office, which I have the honor to hold by the unanimous choice of my fellow citizens, and especially for the expressions which you have pleased to use in testifying the confidence that is reposed in me by your congregation. As the delay which has naturally intervened between my election and your address has afforded an opportunity for appreciating the merits of the federal government and for communicating your sentiments of its administration, I have rather to express my satisfaction than regret at a circumstance." In other words, don't worry you're so late. I appreciate that even after my honeymoon period, you're still attached to me and my administration. And then he adds, this is the third paragraph, "I rejoice that a spirit of liberality and philanthropy is much more prevalent than it formerly was among the enlightened nations on earth, and that your brethren will thereby benefit in proportion as it shall become still more extensive." Here he means to emphasize that even as the Jews have been granted equality at the federal level, not all state legislatures are open to them yet, but he hopes they soon will be. Then in the final paragraph, Washington writes words which are perhaps the most extraordinary, I think, in American Jewish history. The true shtetl farewell moment. Final paragraph. "May the same wonder-working deity who long since delivering the Hebrews from their Egyptian oppressors planted them in the promised land, whose providential agency has lately been conspicuous in establishing these United States as an independent nation, still continue to water them with the dews of heaven and to make the inhabitants of every denomination participate in the temporal and spiritual blessings of that people whose God is," and then he writes the name of the God of the Hebrew Bible, whose name we Jews do not pronounce. In these several lines, Washington makes American Jewry feel as if they truly belonged. And what he tells them is, the God who performed miracles for you in Egypt, it is he who performed miracles for us in the revolution. The God who saved you from tyranny and brought you to the promised land, that same God saved us from tyranny and preserved us in our promised land. Your story is our story parallels your story. And the letter reflects an aspect of the American founding, of how many founders saw in the Exodus a symbol of their own covenantal nation. Thus, Benjamin Franklin in 1776 had proposed for the seal of the United States an image of Moses and Pharaoh at the splitting of the sea, with the motto, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." An amazing idea, Unfortunately, the Continental Congress, instead adopted not that amazing image for the national seal, but instead chose that creepy pyramid with the eye on top of it. I don't know what that's about, but I have it on good authority that it's linked to a treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. But this letter also reflects Washington's search for a religious language that would serve as a means of avoiding interdenominational conflict. This was noted by the Catholic scholar Michael Novak, who wrote that, quote, practically all American Christians erected their main arguments about political life from materials in the Jewish Testament. He's talking about the founding. In national debates, lest their speech be taken as partisan, Christian leaders usually avoided the idioms of rival denominations: Puritan, Quaker, Congregationalist, Episcopal, Unitarian, Methodist, and Universalist. The idiom of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was a religious lingua franca for the founding generation. This, then, is the letter Washington wrote to Georgia and the Jews in June 1790. Then that summer, in August of 1790, the President of the United States paid a visit to Newport, Rhode Island, to reward the state for its ratification of the Constitution at last. And Moses Seixas, leader of the Jewish community there, realizes that now he has to send a letter to Washington. You can only imagine how New York Jews felt when they heard this. The very community that said they couldn't participate in sending the letter now send a letter of its own before New York got around to sending a letter to Washington. Let me just cite a few brief passages from what Moses Seixas of Rhode Island wrote to Washington, and then we'll see Washington's response inside. Moses Seixas wrote, "Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits. Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. Equal parts," he writes, "of the great governmental machine." So again, we find in this letter a celebration of the Constitution and the equality and the ban on religious tests for office. Washington immediately responded the very next day. Let's look at this letter, much more famous than the one sent to Savannah. He writes, third paragraph, "The citizens of the United States have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." Now, the most famous phrase in this letter is his description of the government as one which gives to bigotry no sanction. But Washington did not come up with that phrase. He was merely echoing the letter he had received from the Jews of Rhode Island. But Washington does add a phrase of his own, and that is in the sentence before the bigotry no sanction phrase, where he adds, and we just read this, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights." Washington knew that everyone knew that a century before, John Locke had written his letter concerning religious toleration, an important step in the history of religious liberty, but still a case not for equality, but for toleration. Locke argues, says, look, we can't control what people think anyway, so what's the point of persecuting people? We should tolerate people that don't believe what we do. Except, Locke adds, Catholics and atheists. But everyone else we can tolerate. But Washington is saying to Newport's Jews, this is not England. There you are tolerated. But here you are the same as us. We are embracing, you have the same rights as us. That very same summer, Congress voted to move the Congress to Philadelphia, and Washington moved there. At that point, the president of Philadelphia's Jewish congregation knew that it was now or never, and in touch with and representing the remaining congregations in the United States, he simply, I think, strolled down the street and handed Washington a letter from the rest of the Jewish congregations in America. Washington's response to this third letter was polite but perfunctory. He probably had had enough responding to these Jews that for some reason kept sending him letters. And as embarrassing as this is, we ought to be grateful for this lack of Jewish unity, because otherwise we would not have had these two exquisite pieces of correspondence. And they actually should be taken together in tandem. The letter to Newport speaks of equality, while the letter to Savannah compares biblical Israel with America, reflecting how Washington saw the United States as a covenantal nation, a nation dedicated to a series of ideas that it was now proposing to the world. And so we gather to mark here at Stanford Constitution Day, a day that highlights how America celebrates ideas rather than images, that ours is a covenantal country, a country whose oaths declare fealty to a text rather than to a sovereign of flesh and blood, a country once inspired by the example of biblical Israel. Washington's letter to Savannah is not well known. Unlike the Newport letter, the original Savannah text is lost, meaning the actual letter. But if we wish to see a parallel in the 20th century, we can find it in text that is linked not to the American presidency, but to the first American institution that Washington impacted, which is, of course, the U.S. Armed Forces. And here we come to my second prop. I'm a rabbi. I like bringing props to my speeches. In the 1940s, after World War II, with Jews in Europe, survivors of the Holocaust in DP camps, a German-born rabbi, Samuel Sneag, representing those Jews, approached the U.S. Armed Forces and said that we miss studying our law. We miss studying the Torah. And we miss especially the rabbinic commentary on it, known as the Talmud. We haven't had it for 6, 7, 8 years. Do you think you could print copies of the Talmud for us? Now, of course, the U.S. Army could have just said, no, we're here to liberate Europe, not to go into the Jewish book business. But amazingly, they said yes. And utilizing a printing press that until then had printed Nazi propaganda, they produced 50 copies of the Talmud. If you've ever seen the Talmud, you know it's around 16 to 20 copies of this sized books. I brought this one. I schlepped it all the way from New York because this is a volume from what became known as the U.S. Army Talmud. One wonders, Professor McConnell, what the more secular interpreters of the Establishment Clause would have made of the U.S. Army printing 500 copies of the Jewish Talmud. The only English that appears in it is the following dedication. The cover text, and I urge you to come over after the talk and take a look at it. It has a picture of a concentration camp on the front, and then we have the following. This edition of the Talmud is dedicated to the United States Army. This army played a major role in the rescue of the Jewish people from total annihilation, and after the defeat of Hitler bore the major burden of sustaining the DPs of the Jewish faith. The Jewish DPs will never forget. It says, this special edition of the Talmud, published in the land where but a short time ago everything Jewish was anathema, will remain a symbol of the indestructibility of the Torah. The Jewish DPs will never forget the generous impulses and the unprecedented humanitarianism of the American forces to whom they owe so much. This is certainly the only case in Jewish diaspora history that a government printed copies of the Torah. And it highlights and parallels Washington's own letter to Savannah Jewry about the bond between two covenantal peoples, the Jewish people and the nascent United States, as well as the United States throughout its history. Today, of course, it's not at all clear that there is enough familiarity with the stories of the Hebrew Bible that it could serve as a lingua franca to unite the various members of the diverse people that is the United States. Someone just sent me a clip from a recent episode of Jeopardy! You have to be educated to get on Jeopardy! And the clue was something like, it is in this biblical book that there appears the verse, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Answer is Psalms, of course, but the three contestants just stand there blankly until the buzzer is heard. And when one loses even a knowledge of what inspired the founders. The danger is that one ceases to think of us as a covenantal nation dedicated to ideas, the ideas that we gather today to celebrate. Moreover, in a society of whom many of the educated elite are no longer educated in religious tradition, one will cease to value the value of religion in America itself, which is why, as Professor McConnell said recently in an incredible speech to the Becket Fund, the religious liberty organization on whose board I'm proud to serve, all too often today, religion, there are many who seek in America to relegate religion back to just the house of worship, but not to society itself. Or, as Judge McConnell put it, for this approach, the world will not interfere with religious hermits, but they must keep out of the village. Religious freedom, in this view, said Professor McConnell, is to be protected provided it is irrelevant to the life of the wider community. We may worship however we wish in private. People of faith, in other words, are often asked today to discard their beliefs when they enter the public square. But that is not what America offered the Jews, and it is not what America offered any faith community, as Jews and every other member of every faith community became equal citizens, equal members of the United States. And thus, what Judge McConnell told all those assembled at that event, individuals of many diverse faiths, is exactly what I think Jonas Phillips would have said to people of every faith. Judge McConnell said, "You have just as much a right to be who you are, believe what you believe, and act according to your conscience as anyone else in this free, diverse, and liberal republic." Every year around Memorial Day, our synagogue visits our oldest cemetery, where we plant flags at the members of our congregation that fought in the Revolution, that fought for Washington. One of those graves is that of Jonas Phillips, who died in Philadelphia, but who was, at that period in his life, in an argument with Philadelphia synagogue leadership, and he therefore angrily requested that his body be brought back to New York for burial. But again, as with the letters, I am somewhat grateful for this lack of Jewish unity, because when I participate in those ceremonies, I am now able to reserve to myself the privilege of placing the flag at the grave of Jonas Phillips, reminding me that the Jewish experience of acceptance in America began long before Sandy Koufax. And so I close, therefore, by referencing another baseball player, one who was not Jewish, but who was a great theologian, Yogi Berra, who, it bears mentioning, passed away on Yom Kippur, and not just any Yom Kippur, but the 50th Yom Kippur to the day that Sandy Koufax refrained from playing. Surely a sign of Yogi Berra's spiritual and theological greatness. Yogi Berra was once told that the mayor of Dublin, Ireland, was Jewish, and Yogi famously reflected and said, "The mayor of Dublin is Jewish? Only in America." Only in America, indeed. I thank all of you for the opportunity to explain the story of my fellow Jews who became citizens in this covenantal nation, for the opportunity to describe the beacon of equality that they found in this series of words, and the opportunity to express to you the hope that the exceptional nature of this republic endures. Thank you very much. Sure.
I thank our speaker for that extraordinary address, and he's agreed to take some questions from the audience. There are microphones here in the aisles, so if you would please and speak clearly into the microphone so that those who are later going to listen to the tape of this program will be able to hear your question. So just line up as you will, and I'm going to get out of the way here.
Stick around.
So Daniel Kim has their first question.
Terrific.
Thank you so much. I'm a 3L here at Stanford Law, and I sort of see the tension between this idea that the Hebrew Bible being the lingua franca, like the uniting kind of force, but at the same time, the sort of the regardless of what your faith background is, you are accepted into this society.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of, I don't know, reconcile, like what is the founders' kind of approach to those who don't even share anything about the Hebrew Bible?
Right. So, of course, we should bear in mind that not all of the founders were that devout either. Franklin and Jefferson, Franklin was not the most devout of the founders. He chose that suggested seal because he knew the imagery that was common knowledge of those that lived in America at that time. Now, if you then take us forward to a time when, let's say, we are more diverse, what does the Hebrew Bible offer to everyone? I would just answer this. For the founders, at least in the way they describe it, the equality of every member of humanity that lies at the heart of the American idea can be defended first and foremost based on the notion, the biblical notion, because this is not found in classical literature. In other words, if we see the West as impacted first and foremost by Athens and Jerusalem, what is not found in Athens at all is the concept of human equality, male and female, because human beings are created in the image of God. Even Jefferson, not that devout, in one of his reflection on slavery, to which he did not live up to, but these are words that are on the Jefferson Memorial. Jefferson wrote something like, "The God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of this nation be secure when we have removed the conviction that these liberties are the gift of God?" So whether one believes in all the doctrines of the Hebrew Bible, what the lingua franca of the Hebrew Bible offered to the founders was two notions. The notion of equality, which lies at the heart of the American idea. I would give a whole separate talk about that, but this is not Declaration Day. This is Constitution Day. Happy to come back for Declaration Day, if there's a Declaration Day. Jonas Phillips, there's a whole great declaration story about Jonas Phillips, because Jonas Phillips in 1776 sent a copy of the Declaration a month after it was produced to Europe, along with a letter. And that letter that he wrote is now in the London Public Records Office, because the British boarded that ship, and they couldn't understand his letter. They just saw the treasonous declaration. So they assumed they couldn't read the letter because it was a patriot code. The letter was utterly innocuous. It was just in Yiddish. But it's an amazing Yiddish letter about the Declaration of Independence, and Jonas Phillips describes the Declaration. But that said, it offers that, and it offers the concept of covenant. Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote in a wonderful book, in my view his best book, which I recommend to all of you, called The Home We Build Together, which is a critique of multiculturalism, or the excesses of multiculturalism. And he's writing this not for America, he's writing this for Britain, but he's writing it inspired by the American experience as the chief rabbi of Britain. And what he argues therein, he says that Jews in England experience originally life not as equals. They experienced it as guests in a country home. They are like guests at Downton Abbey. It's amazing staying at Downton Abbey, but if you're not the Earl of Grantham, then you don't have a right to decide what's going on in Downton Abbey. He says, and then with multiculturalism, what we have is people not living in a country home, but every person living in their own hotel room with nothing binding them. But the American concept of covenant, in which people bind together to devote themselves to an idea, that's a notion that comes from the Bible. That's a concept that can unite a diverse community. And so that's what I think the lingua franca of the Hebrew Bible offers to America, whether or not one believes in all the doctrines that are put forth in there. But of course, one must at least be literate with the political thought of the Bible in order to embrace these doctrines, these concepts. Thank you for a great question. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Rabbi.
Good evening.
One in my position often says, the last questioner took my question.
Yes.
But you took my question just 2 seconds ago.
Yes.
In your series, Jerusalem 365.
Wow.
Which,
Thank you for listening. Yeah.
Professor McConnell, after you're done with Bible 365, I would recommend Jerusalem 365. You describe the difference between covenant and contract.
Yeah.
And so you've talked about covenant. Would you, as they used to say in the college papers, compare and contrast
I'd love
covenant with contract?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So this is really at the heart. I owe credit to this to Rabbi Sachs's book that I just referenced. What Rabbi Sachs notes in this book is that there's two different sorts of social compacts. From political philosophy, Locke, Rousseau, etc., we have a notion of social contract, in which one is willing to give away some of one's rights to achieve something greater for one's own self-interest. And then in the Bible, we have a concept of covenant. The two are very different. Contract is based on self-interest. A covenant is about individuals coming together to achieve something larger than the sum of their parts. You're not out for self-interest, it's the opposite. But the main point that Rabbi Sachs makes, and this is super important, is that both concepts are valuable, that a truly just society incorporates both concepts. Because a society that's all about self-interest is not a genuine society. But a society that's all covenant and no self-interest is not a society either. It's a sect or a totalitarianism. In the 20th century, we have seen examples of political thought in which it was assumed that everyone could give up all self-interest. And we see where that led. And rightly understood, all true and truly just forms of compact combine both. So it's often said that in religion, in religious thought, marriage is a covenant. And indeed it is. But as I say to my students when I teach political thought, I say, if I stood under a chuppah, a Jewish wedding canopy, and said to the bride or to the groom, I want you to know now that your spouse who is covenanting with you, he doesn't get anything personally out of this relationship. He's just covenanting with you in order to do something for you. Mazel tov. That would be the worst speech one could ever give. Because any genuine relationship is a combination of both self-interest, but also achieving something beyond oneself. So contract and covenant need to be joined together in a truly just society, I think. It's a great question. Thank you.
So I made the mistake of glancing at my watch, and given that, let's have one more question.
Thanks again, Rabbi. Bruce Cahan from Stanford. But I've also been to your synagogue.
Thank you for coming.
And,
I don't know if you know, but it's the oldest synagogue, congregation. It's the oldest congregation in America.
They handed out flyers at the door.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm surprised that we didn't stamp it on your hands as part of admission.
They recruited them from Lincoln Center Synagogue.
Yeah.
Anyway, I too celebrate the late Rabbi Sachs. He was very kind to me there at his synagogue. And I wonder, given the Sephardic tradition of your synagogue, some of us are studying the Sephardic diaspora, and that the Sephardic Jews left Spain and Portugal. They went every which way they could. I wonder whether when we study the Torah and we see Moses interpreting God's will for a new place, this promised land, and a new economy by which it would be fair, whether you found some connection between the Sephardic diaspora and your study of our Constitution and what it wanted, especially at a time when the revolution was to break off the control of the British bankers controlling the colonists.
So I think it's a very, very interesting question to raise the question of Sephardic Jewry. Everyone knows about Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jewry? Okay. So I would say this, it's a huge topic, but I would say the following. The Sephardim, especially the Sephardim, grew up with the stories and legends of Jews who lived and acted as statesmen and sought and worked on behalf of their people, often audaciously. Jonas Phillips, who was himself Ashkenazic, married his wife, Rebecca Mendez Machado, into one of the elite Sephardic families of the United States. And in my recently published book, which is called Providence and Power, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship, available on Amazon.com and wherever books are sold, unless you want to wait for the movie.
There's no tie?
Starring,
Not on the
obviously,
tie?
Brad Pitt as me. But I have a chapter there on Menashe ben Israel, the Sephardic rabbi who audaciously lobbied Cromwell when he was Lord Protector of England, to allow Jews back into England after having been expelled in 1290. And what you'll see in the letter that he writes Cromwell is an incredibly audacious case for who the Jewish people were, the loyal citizens of the English Republic at the time that they could be. And he makes the case, and he was not fully successful in his age, I write about this, he makes the case for full Jewish equality in 1655, 1656. No Jewish argument of that sort had been made before, I think, ever. And in that chapter, I describe how you see how the legends of Sephardic statesmanship drive the audacity and the courage and the eloquence of Menashe ben Israel. And there's no question that the Jews of America, who were at that point around 50% Ashkenazi, 50% Sephardi, but were all praying the liturgy of the Sephardim, were living with those legends. And you see echoes of Menashe ben Israel in the incredible letter of Jonas Phillips to George Washington.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So I was going to ask you to join me in thanking Reverend Soloveichik again, but you've just beaten me to the punch. So now let me invite everyone to the reception, which will be right outside, and you'll have a chance to both mingle and maybe to ask further questions.
Thank you.
So